The massive war chamber fell silent as Commander Vexstar limped across the polished floor, his purple carapace bearing deep scars that told stories of violence and survival. Every step echoed through the vast space, a reminder of the battles that had nearly destroyed him. The assembled officers of the Galactic Coalition shifted uncomfortably in their floating seats, their various alien forms creating a living rainbow of colors and textures in the dim blue light. Vexstar had seen this room filled with celebration after countless victories. Today, it felt like a tomb. "You summoned me to speak of the humans." Vexstar's voice rumbled through his translator device, the mechanical words carrying none of the pain that showed in his compound eyes. "Many of you believe our defeat was merely a political decision. You are wrong." Admiral Krell Tox, a massive slug-like being with 4 arms, leaned forward in his chair. "Commander, surely you're not suggesting that these Previes actually posed a real threat to our armada?" A younger Krillian officer, his crystalline features gleaming with reflected light, scoffed loudly. "Humans are barely out of their primitive phase. They still use fossil fuels on half their planets. How could they possibly silence?" Vexstar's mandibles clicked dangerously, the sound sharp enough to cut through steel. The younger officer's crystalline face immediately lost its glow. "I have faced them in battle. I have seen what they are capable of. I have watched them do things that should have been impossible." Vexstar activated his personal datapad, and the room's central holographic display burst to life. The image showed grainy footage of the first human ships entering Coalition space 3 years ago. They looked like flying scrap heaps compared to the sleek Coalition vessels. 3 years ago, when their colony ships first entered our space, we thought them easy. "Pray, look at these vessels." He gestured at the hologram with one scarred claw. Crude metal constructs, held together by welds and determination. No elegant curves, no energy shielding, no quantum drives. Just big, ugly, functional machines that looked like they were built in someone's garage. The footage showed a Coalition patrol intercepting the human convoy. The sleek silver Coalition ships looked like graceful predators circling clumsy prey. Our energy weapons should have cut through them like plasma through vapor. We had technology that could melt asteroids, shields that could deflect starfire. They had ... what appeared to be scrap metal and stubbornness. He paused the footage at the moment the first shots were fired. Instead, their kinetic weapons, simple metal projectiles fired by chemical explosives, penetrated our shields as if they didn't exist, while we relied on sophisticated energy matrices and quantum field manipulation. They had perfected the art of making things go very fast and hit very hard. The display showed Coalition ships reeling from impacts, their elegant hulls cracked in bleeding atmosphere. The human ships, meanwhile, kept firing with mechanical precision. "Look at this, Vexstar," zoomed in on one of the human vessels. "Do you see those scorch marks? Those holes? They were taking direct hits from our plasma cannons and still fighting. Our hulls were designed not to avoid damage, but to survive." General Vextra, a insectoid being with 4 legs and razor-sharp claws, chittered nervously. "But surely our numerical advantage meant nothing." Vexter cut her off. "Because while we were busy trying to disable their ships without damaging the valuable cargo, they were trying to kill us. Every shot they fired was meant to end lives, not capture prizes." The footage continued, showing the human ships moving. With surprising coordination, they didn't fight like civilized beings seeking territory or resources. They fought like cornered animals protecting their young. "Watch this human ship here," Vexter pointed to a battered vessel on the edge of the formation. Engine damage, hull breaches, life support failing. Any rational species would have surrendered. Instead, they rammed it into our flagship. The chamber erupted in murmurs. Several officers made sounds of disbelief. The impact killed everyone. "Aboard both ships," Vexstar continued, his voice growing quieter. "Hundreds of lives lost in seconds, but it also crippled our command structure and gave the rest of their convoy time to escape. They traded 1 ship and 50 lives for our flagship and 300 of our finest warriors." He turned to face the assembled officers directly. "That was our first mistake. We underestimated them. We assumed they would fight like us, with honor and restraint and regard for the value of life. Instead, they fought like extinction was the only alternative to victory. The hologram shifted to show tactical analysis data. Our computers calculated their actions as irrational, inefficient, wasteful. We didn't understand that for humans. There is no such thing as acceptable losses when protecting what they love. They don't fight to win territory or resources. They fight to survive, and a species fighting for survival is the most dangerous thing in the universe. Vexstar's mandibles clicked slowly, a sign of deep thought among his people. It would not be our last mistake. In fact, it was just the beginning of our education in human warfare. The chamber fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over the assembled officers like a shroud. The siege of Kepler Station was to be our great victory, Vexstar continued, his voice growing distant with memory. The scars on his carapace seemed to pulse with remembered pain. 50,000 humans, trapped on a mining station with nowhere to run. We surrounded them with 200,000 of our finest warriors from across the galaxy. The hologram shifted, showing the tactical layout of the station floating in the void like a metal flower. The surrounding coalition fleet looked like a swarm of deadly insects, their ships forming perfect attack formations that had crushed 100 worlds. Look at this station, Vexstar gestured with his clawed hand. It was never meant to be a fortress. Just a simple mining operation, drilling for rare metals in the asteroid belt. Thin walls, basic life support, no military defenses. Our war computers said it would fall in 6 hours. The display zoomed in, showing the station's crude construction. Compared to coalition architecture, it looked like a child's toy made from spare parts. They had 3 weeks of supplies. We had enough firepower to crack a planet in half. Victory seemed certain. His mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter. Our admiral sent them a message offering honorable surrender. Standard procedure, really. Most species see reason when faced with impossible odds. The hologram showed the communication logs, displaying the human response in glowing text. Their commander, a female named Hey1, responded with 2 words that would haunt my dreams. Come take it. The display shifted to show the brutal siege that followed. Wave after wave of coalition forces crashed against the station's defenses, like ocean waves against a rocky shore. But these waves were made of plasma fire and screaming metal. Expected them to break after the first day. Instead, they turned every corridor into a killing field. Every room became a fortress. They welded blast doors shut, filled hallways with debris, and created choke points where our numerical advantage meant nothing. Vexstar's voice grew harder as he remembered. I was part of the 3rd assault wave. We breached the outer hull expecting to find panicked civilians. Instead, we found soldiers who had turned maintenance tunnels into sniper nests. They knew every inch of that station, every pipe, every ventilation shaft. We were fighting them. In their own home? The hologram showed thermal imaging of the battles inside the station. Red dots representing coalition forces moved through the corridors like blood cells, while blue dots showed human defenders in seemingly impossible positions. They fought with a precision that defied logic. Every shot counted. Every position was defended to the last breath. I watched a human soldier named Biorim carry ammunition to his wounded comrades, then return to his position with a severed leg dragging behind him. Blood was pooling beneath him, but he kept loading his weapon, kept firing, kept fighting, continued, until blood loss finally claimed him. The chamber was dead silent now, the only sound the soft hum of the holographic projectors. We thought we had them beaten. We'd controlled 60% of the station. Our supplies were running low. Their ammunition was almost gone. That's when they started using improvised weapons. Mining charges became grenades. Industrial tools became weapons. They melted down metal scraps to make bullets. Vexstar's compound eyes seemed to stare into the past. Day 31, they lost their main power generator. We expected surrender. Instead, they rigged emergency lighting and kept fighting in the dark. They knew every shadow, every corner. We were stumbling blind while they moved like ghosts. Display showed coalition forces struggling through darkened corridors. their advanced night vision useless against enemies who didn't need to see to kill. Day 47, I personally led an assault on their medical bay. I expected to find weakness, fear, maybe wounded soldiers we could take prisoner. Instead, I found something that shook me to my core. Vexstar paused, his mandibles clicking. Slowly, human medics treating our wounded alongside their own. A young male named Tejo was holding pressure on a Krillian soldier's wound, while his own arm hung useless at his side. When he saw me, he didn't reach for a weapon. He asked if I needed medical attention. The room was completely silent now, the weight of his words settling over the assembled officers like a heavy blanket. I had come to kill him, and he offered to heal me. That's when I understood we weren't fighting normal soldiers. We were fighting something else entirely. Something that could show mercy and ruthlessness in the same breath. The hologram shifted to show casualty reports, the numbers, climbing steadily day by day. Day 68, they started rationing water. Day 73, they were eating recycled protein paste. Day 81, they were breathing recycled air so thin it should have killed them. But they kept fighting. Every day, every hour, every minute, Vexstar's voice grew quieter, more respectful. Day 96, we received intelligence that human reinforcements were 3 weeks away. We increased our attacks, trying to finish them before help arrived. They seemed to know this too, because their resistance became even more fierce. The display showed the final weeks of the siege, coalition forces throwing everything they had. At the station, while the human defenders held on by sheer willpower, Day 112, they lost their water recycling system. Day 118, life support failed in half the station. Day 123, they were down to their last few hundred fighters. We could taste victory. Vexstar. Mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation. They fought for 127 days. When our reinforcements finally arrived to witness our triumph, we discovered the truth that would change everything we thought we knew about warfare. The hologram expanded to show the entire star system, revealing dozens of human ships in perfect attack positions around the coalition fleet. They hadn't been trapped at all. They had been buying time for their fleet to position itself. While we were focused on taking the station, they were surrounding us. We had been the ones under siege, and we never knew it. The implications hit. The assembled officers like a physical blow. They'd been outmaneuvered by the very species they considered primitive. 50,000 humans had held off 200,000 coalition warriors for over 4 months. Not because they were trapped, but because they chose to. They had turned what we thought was their prison into our tomb. The most haunting encounter came during the Battle of Proxima Ridge. Vexstar's voice carried a weight that made even the most hardened officers lean forward. The battle-scarred commander seemed to shrink into himself as he recalled the memory. I was wounded, separated from my unit, bleeding out in a crater when she found me. The hologram flickered to life, showing the hellish landscape of Proxima Ridge. Twisted metal debris from crashed ships littered the rocky ground like the bones of dead giants. Smoke rose from burning fuel cells, creating an orange haze that blocked out the twin suns overhead. The battle had been raging for 18 hours. Our forces were winning, pushing the human defenders back ridge by ridge. I was leading a flanking maneuver when their artillery found us. The explosion threw me 30 meters into a crater filled with the wreckage of both our ships. The display showed thermal imaging of the battlefield, red dots representing coalition forces advancing, while blue dots marked human positions falling back in organized retreat. I lay there for 3 hours, my purple blood mixing with the alien soil. The communication device was destroyed, my weapon was gone, and I could feel my life draining away with each heartbeat. I had given up hope when I heard footsteps approaching. Mandibles clicked nervously as he remembered. I expected to see coalition medics, or perhaps human soldiers coming to finish me off. Instead, I saw something that confused me completely. The hologram showed a human female in medical fatigues, her face obscured by a tactical mask and protective goggles. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to work under fire. Her name was Sujin, combat medic, barely older than a hatchling by human standards. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old, but she carried herself with the confidence of a veteran. She could have left me to die, could have taken me prisoner, could have called for backup to capture a coalition officer. Zoomed in on the medic's equipment. Her medical kit was sophisticated but practical, designed for battlefield conditions rather than sterile hospitals. Instead, she knelt beside me in that crater, under enemy fire, and started working to save my life. She used her own medical supplies to seal my wounds, gave me water from her own canteen, and spoke softly to keep me conscious while she worked. Her hands never shook, even when plasma bolts were flying overhead. Vexstar's claws traced the faded scars on his carapace. Following the precise lines where Sujin had sealed his wounds, she told me about her home while she worked. About the cherry blossoms that bloomed near her childhood home in the spring. She described how the pink petals would fall like snow, covering the ground in a soft carpet that children would play in. The chamber was absolutely silent now, every officer hanging on his words. She spoke of her brother Dongwu, who served on a medical ship somewhere in the void. How he had taught her the basics of field medicine before she joined the military. How their parents had wanted both of them to stay home and be safe, but they felt called to serve. She made me remember that even in war, there exists compassion. The hologram shifted to show the medic's careful work, her movements precise and gentle despite the chaos around them. She could have simply patched me up and left. Instead, she stayed for 2 hours, making sure I was stable, that the bleeding had stopped, that I wouldn't die from shock. She even left me extra water and some food rations. Vexstar's voice grew heavier. Before she left, she looked at me through her mask and said something in her language. My translator was damaged, but I understood the tone. She was apologizing for having to leave me there, for the war, for everything that had brought us to that moment. The display showed the medic disappearing into the smoke and debris, returning to her own lines. 6 hours later, she escaped from our perimeter. 12 hours after that, she led a counterattack that decimated my battalion. I watched through my rifle scope as she coordinated medical evacuations while simultaneously directing artillery strikes. She saved lives and took them with equal skill. The hologram showed the counterattack with Sujin at the center of the action. She was helping wounded soldiers to safety with one hand while calling in airstrikes with the other. She moved like a dancer across that battlefield, beautiful and deadly. When coalition soldiers fell, she would treat their wounds if she could. When human soldiers needed covering fire, she would pick up a weapon and fight. She was a healer, and a warrior switching between roles as easily as breathing. Vexstar's voice grew quieter, more personal. I realized she had probably saved dozens of coalition lives that day, even while fighting us. She didn't see enemies and allies. She saw wounded beings who needed help, and threats that needed to be eliminated. The chamber was so quiet that the hum of the life support systems seemed deafening. When we met again 3 days later, she hesitated. For just a moment, looking at me down the barrel of her weapon, she hesitated. I was leading another assault, and she was defending a field hospital. Our eyes met across 50 meters of battlefield, and I saw recognition in her face. The hologram showed that moment, frozen in time. To warriors who had shared a moment of humanity in the midst of horror. She could have killed me easily. Her weapon was already aimed, her finger on the trigger. But she paused, and in that pause, I saw something that terrified me more than any weapon. Not mercy, but the terrible burden of having to fight someone. She had healed. She was carrying the weight of every life she had saved and every life she had taken. Vexstar's mandibles clicked slowly, thoughtfully. In that moment, I understood the true horror of humanity. They don't wage war from hatred or bloodlust or territorial ambition. They wage war from necessity, from duty, from love of what they're protecting. They are capable of infinite compassion and infinite violence. Sometimes in the same breath, the hologram faded, leaving only the scarred commander and his haunting words. She lowered her weapon and disappeared into the smoke. I never saw her again, but I never forgot her. Sujin taught me that humans don't fight because they enjoy killing. They fight because they must, and that makes them far more dangerous than any species that kills for pleasure. But nothing prepared us for what they called Protocol Omega. Vexstar's voice dropped to almost a whisper. The massive war chamber seemed to grow colder as he spoke, and several officers unconsciously leaned back in their seats. It was during the assault on Colony 7. We had cornered an entire human battalion, 300 soldiers trapped in a supply depot with no hope of escape or rescue. The hologram flickered to life, showing aerial footage of the surrounded facility. The depot looked like a metal box dropped onto a barren planet, completely surrounded by coalition forces that stretched to the horizon like a dark ocean. Colony 7 was supposed to be a routine mop-up operation. The main human fleet had already retreated, leaving behind only a rear guard to cover their escape. Our intelligence said these soldiers were cut off, abandoned, with no way to call for help. The display zoomed in on the facility, showing its basic construction. It was never meant to be a fortress, just a simple storage building for mining equipment and supplies. We outnumbered them 20-1, 6,000 of our finest warriors against 300 humans with limited ammunition and no heavy weapons. Victory was a mathematical certainty. Our computers calculated the battle would be over in 2 hours, with minimal coalition casualties. Vexstar's compound eyes seemed to focus on something far away, lost in the memory. I was confident this would be easy. We had them surrounded, cut off from supplies, with nowhere to run. Their position was hopeless. The hologram showed coalition forces in perfect formation, their weapons trained on the depot from every angle. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry units had created an impenetrable ring around the facility, and their commander, a scarred veteran, named Hien Wu, broadcast a message to his troops on an open channel. He wanted us to hear it. His voice was calm, almost peaceful, as he spoke. Protocol Omega is now in effect. Make them remember us. The display shifted to show thermal imaging of the battle that followed. At first, the human heat signatures moved normally inside the building. Then something changed. What happened next defied every tactical doctrine we knew. Instead of trying to break out or find cover, they began dismantling their own equipment. They stripped their weapons for maximum firepower, removed safety limiters from their energy cells, and shared their ammunition with deadly efficiency. Vexstar's mandibles clicked nervously as he remembered. They turned maintenance tools into weapons. Plasma cutters became flamethrowers. Industrial loaders became mobile gun platforms. They welded metal plates together to create firing positions that could withstand our heaviest weapons. The hologram showed the transformation happening inside the depot. Humans working with incredible speed and coordination, turning a simple storage facility into a death trap. They created overlapping fields of fire that turned their position into a killing maze. Every entrance was covered by multiple weapons. Every corridor became a funnel where our numerical advantage meant nothing. They knew they wouldn't survive, but they made their death so costly that my entire fleet was crippled. The display showed the first coalition assault waves hitting the depot. What should have been a quick victory turned into a nightmare. Soldiers fell in waves to the devastating crossfire. I watched from the command center as our first wave was destroyed in minutes. Elite warriors who had conquered planets were cut down like wheat before the scythe. The humans had turned physics itself into a weapon. Vexstar's voice grew quieter, more respectful. But it wasn't just the tactics that terrified us. It was the individuals. Each human soldier became something more than mortal when Protocol Omega was activated. The hologram focused on thermal signatures of individual defenders. I watched a human female named the Jinn, no more than 20 years old, hold a corridor, alone for 47 minutes. She had been shot 6 times, her left arm was shattered, and she was bleeding from a head wound that should have killed her instantly. The display showed her heat signature, flickering and fading but never falling. But she kept fighting, kept killing, until the very last round was fired. When her rifle ran dry, she picked up weapons from fallen coalition soldiers. When those were empty, she used grenades. When the grenades were gone, she fought with a piece of broken metal. The chamber was dead silent now, the only sound the soft hum of the holographic projectors. She killed 43 coalition soldiers in that corridor. 43 trained warriors, each with years of combat experience, fell to a 20-year-old human who should have been dead a dozen times over. When she finally collapsed, she was still trying to reload an empty weapon. Vexstar's claws scraped against the podium as he gripped it tighter. That was just one soldier. There were 299 others just like her, each one fighting beyond the limits of biology, beyond the boundaries of what we thought possible. The hologram showed the battle raging for hours, coalition forces throwing everything they had at the depot, while the human defenders held on through sheer willpower and tactical brilliance. By the 6th hour, we had lost over 2,000 soldiers. By the 10th hour, 3,000. Our commanders were demanding explanations for how 300 humans were destroying an entire division. The display showed casualty reports scrolling past in glowing red numbers. But the humans weren't just killing us. They were teaching us something far more terrifying. They were showing us what happens when a species decides that death is preferable to surrender. Vexstar's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of deep distress among his species. On the 14th hour, the last human fell. Hyanwu himself, still firing his weapon with one hand while using his other to hold his organs inside his body. When silence finally fell, we had lost over 4,000 soldiers to their 300. No. The room remained silent as the implications sank in. A force that outnumbered the enemy 20-1 had suffered casualties at a rate that made victory meaningless. The tactical recordings still give our strategists nightmares. They study those files, trying to understand how it was possible, how 300 soldiers could cause such devastation. But they're asking the wrong question. Vexstar turned to face the assembled officers directly. The question isn't how they did it. The question is, what kind of species creates a protocol that turns certain death into victory? In their final hour, outnumbered and outgunned, they had achieved something impossible. They had made us afraid. The hologram faded, leaving only the scarred commander and the weight of his words hanging in the air like a funeral shroud. Protocol Omega wasn't just a battle tactic. It was a promise. A promise that even in death, humans would make their enemies pay such a terrible price that victory would feel like defeat. The war ended not with human defeat, but with our plea for ceasefire. Vexstar's admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The assembled officers shifted uncomfortably, their various alien forms creating a symphony of nervous clicks, chirps, and rustles. We had won every major battle, taken every strategic objective, and yet we were losing the war. The hologram burst to life, showing casualty reports, supply lines, and troop movements across multiple star systems. The data painted a picture that defied military logic, a winning side that was being slowly destroyed by its own victories. Look at these numbers. Vexstar gestured at the floating statistics. Battle after battle, we achieved tactical victory. We destroyed their fleets, captured their worlds, eliminated their military leadership. By every measure we understood, we were winning decisively. The display showed coalition forces advancing across human space like a dark tide, overwhelming everything in their path. Human resistance seemed to crumble wherever the coalition struck. But then we noticed something strange. Every human death created 10 more volunteers from their vast population. Every atrocity committed against their civilians turned their entire species into implacable enemies. We weren't fighting an army, we were fighting the collective will of an entire species that refused to be conquered. Vexstar's mandibles clicked thoughtfully as he remembered. At first, we thought it was propaganda. Desperate recruitment drives by a failing government. We were wrong. It was something far more dangerous. The hologram shifted to show recruitment centers across human space. Lines of civilians stretched for kilometers, all waiting to volunteer for military service. Young and old, male and female, all united by a single purpose. I learned this from a prisoner, a young engineer named Ji-hoon. He had been captured during a raid on a supply convoy. Small, quiet, barely 25 years old. He fixed water purification systems for civilian colonies, hardly a military threat. The display showed the interrogation room where Vexstar had questioned the prisoner. Ji-hoon sat calmly across from his captor, showing no fear despite being surrounded by alien warriors. While in custody, he spoke of his sister Minru, who had volunteered for military service after her colony was bombed. She had been a teacher before the war, specializing in childhood education. After watching her students die in the attack, she learned to pilot fighter craft and joined the Space Navy. His voice grew heavier with each word. He spoke of his father, Seokjin, who had retrained as a weapons manufacturer at the age of 63. This man had spent his entire life building irrigation systems for farming communities. When the war began, he learned to build guns instead of water pipes. The chamber was completely silent now, every officer hanging on his words. He spoke of his mother, Yunhua, who organized civilian evacuation efforts while under fire. She was a librarian before the war, someone who spent her days helping children find books. When the coalition attacked, she learned to coordinate refugee movements and medical supplies while plasma bolts fell around her. Vextar's claws scraped against the podium, leaving deep scratches in the metal. Every human had a story. Every human had a reason to fight. They weren't soldiers by profession, they were ordinary beings who had been pushed beyond their limits and discovered they had no limits at all. The hologram showed scenes from across human space. Farmers building weapons in their barns. Students training for combat between classes. Elderly citizens running supply convoys through war zones. An entire species mobilizing for total war. A baker named Sung-ho started making explosives instead of bread. A musician named Hai-jin used her touring network to run intelligence operations. A doctor named Wu-jin trained civilians in battlefield medicine between treating wounded soldiers. Chamber stirred as officers began to understand the true scope of what they had faced. This wasn't a military they were fighting, it was an entire civilization that had turned itself into a weapon. The final battle was at their home system, Earth. We arrived with a fleet of 10,000 vessels, expecting to end their resistance once and for all. Our war computers calculated that Earth's defenses would fall within 48 hours. Holograms showed the Coalition's final assault fleet, a armada so massive it blocked out the stars, ships from every member species, carrying enough firepower to sterilize a dozen worlds. Instead, we found something that chilled our warrior hearts. An entire species that had turned itself into a weapon. Earth's orbital defenses were unlike anything we had seen. Not because they were advanced, but because they were everywhere. The display showed Earth's orbital defenses, massive installations that bristled with weapons. But these weren't sleek. Military stations, they were converted civilian structures. Space stations, mining platforms, even cargo containers had been turned into fortresses. Every human citizen had become a soldier. Every civilian structure had become a fortress. Every man, woman, and child had chosen to fight rather than surrender. They had no superweapons, no advanced technology, no secret advantages. They had only their refusal to give up. Vextar's voice grew quieter, more respectful. I watched through our tactical displays as children too young to hold weapons ran ammunition to adult fighters. I saw elderly humans who could barely walk. Manning communication stations under fire. I watched pregnant females coordinating defense networks while seeking shelter for their unborn. The hologram showed the battle for Earth, a fight that lasted not hours but weeks. Every ship, every station, every floating piece of debris became a battleground. We destroyed their orbital platforms, and they kept fighting from the wreckage. We eliminated their fleet, and civilian ships joined the battle. We bombed their surface installations, and they fought from underground tunnels. There was no breaking point because there was nothing left to break. Vextar's voice dropped too, barely above a whisper. I realized then that we had made a fundamental error. We had assumed that victory meant breaking their will to fight. But humans don't break. They adapt. They endure. They find hope in hopeless situations and turn that hope into a weapon more powerful than any we possessed. The commander straightened, his scarred form somehow seeming larger in the dim light. On the 31st day of the battle for Earth, our war council met in emergency session. We had lost 60% of our fleet. Our supply lines were stretched beyond breaking. Our member species were questioning whether this war was worth the cost. The hologram showed the final meeting. Coalition leaders from across the galaxy gathering to discuss something unthinkable: surrender. We called them primitive. They taught us that the most dangerous weapon in the universe isn't technology. It's the refusal to surrender when everything you love is at stake. They taught us that sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when to stop fighting. The chamber remained silent for a long moment before Vexstar spoke his final words. We are here today not because we defeated the humans, but because they chose to let us live. When we offered the ceasefire, they could have pressed their advantage. They could have hunted us across the galaxy. Instead, they chose mercy. His compound eyes swept across the assembled officers. Remember that? Remember it well. And pray to whatever gods you hold dear that we never give them reason to change their minds. The hologram faded, leaving only the scarred veteran and the weight of his words hanging in the air like a funeral shroud. In the silence that followed, every officer in the chamber understood that they had not just lost a war, they had encountered something that would change the galaxy forever. The end.